We all love watching a scary series once in a while. It's a fun, safe way to get your blood pumping. But living through the story in real life is quite different. If you're one of the millions of people who've seen Netflix's new hit, The Watcher, then you might have missed the most terrifying part. It's actually true. While the series changed some details, the main plot is based on a real family who really were threatened by an anonymous writer known as The Watcher. We have the true story for you. This is everything Netflix is hiding about The Watcher. Most movies and TV shows based on real crimes choose stories from decades ago. In that way, The Watcher stands out from the pack because the crime is based on happened as recently as 2017. It all started when the Broaddus family purchased their dream home. It was a huge $1.3 million house called 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. It was pretty close to where Mum Maria Broaddus grew up, but her husband Derek loved it just as much as her. The huge house was the perfect place to raise their 3 children, in a neighborhood known for its friendliness and safety, or so they thought. Unlike the Netflix series, the family wasn't living in the house when the trouble started. They were still renovating and creating their perfect space when Derek opened the mailbox one day. He had no idea that simple action would change his life. Inside the mailbox were the usual bills and flyers, but there was one letter that stood out. It was addressed to the new owner in messy handwriting, but it didn't feature the sender's name or really anything other than the family's new address. Derek opened the mysterious letter immediately. The printed letter started nicely enough, saying, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood." That was where the niceness ended. After that, it got really creepy really fast. The note told the family that 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. It then described how the writer's father and grandfather before him had been watching the family's new house since the 1920s. It then asked if the Broaddus family knew the history of the house and what lay within its walls. It didn't give much away. Instead of introducing themselves, the letter writer wrote this instead. "Who am I? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I am in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. Think it can't get any worse? You're wrong." It quickly turned into a threat to the family's children. The writer said he had counted 3 of them, which is correct, and it then referred to the Broaddus children as young blood. It also said, "Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me." It closed with the words, "Welcome, my friends, welcome. Let the party begin." And it was signed, The Watcher. Obviously, that's pretty terrifying. Derek wasted no time telling his wife about the letter. They immediately asked the previous owners if they'd ever received any letters like this one in the 23 years they'd lived there. They said no, except there was one note they'd received right before they moved out. The previous owners, the Woods family, said the note they got did sound like the letter the Broaddus family had received, but they hadn't thought much of it and threw it out. But the Watcher sure knew the Woods. Some sources say that in his letter to the Broaddus family, the Watcher said the Woods were the ones who'd brought the young blood to him like he'd requested. Still, the Broaddus family didn't think the Woods were suspects, mainly because they went to the police with Derek and Maria to report the letters. The police advised them not to discuss the letters with anyone. Absolutely everyone was a suspect. But there were no leads that helped them find the Watcher. The family figured they should forget about it, but 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was even more sinister. The Watcher now knew the family's names. He'd misspelled Broaddus, but that wasn't very reassuring. The most frightening part is, he didn't just know their real names, he also knew the nicknames the family used in private. Each child had one that was only known to those closest to them, but the Watcher now knew them all. That could mean a few very unsettling things. The Watcher might be someone close to the family. He might have bugged the house, or even worse, he really was watching the family from so close by that he could hear their private conversations. The new letter only got more terrifying. Derek had set up an easel on the front porch so his young daughter could paint while he was working on the house. In the letter, the Watcher said he'd been observing her and asked if she was the artist in the family. If that wasn't bad enough on its own, there's one detail you'd never know if you hadn't seen the house. That part of the porch had large bushes in front of it that meant it couldn't be seen from the street. Either the watcher had to have been right up close to the house to see her, or he had to be in the house right next door. The family that lived there became immediate suspects. They'd been there a long time, and all the adult children of the family lived in the house with their mother, including a 61-year-old man who hardly ever left the house. He became prime suspect. He agreed to a police interview, but he never showed. The police didn't have enough evidence to force him to talk then, so they had to let it go. The second letter also contained a seriously disturbing paragraph. It read, "Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream." It then said he'd be watching through the windows to see where each family member would sleep so he could plan better. The family stopped bringing the children to the house and decided to wait a while before they decided to move in. They weren't really visiting the house anymore, but that didn't stop the watcher. A couple of weeks later, another letter arrived. It asked where they were, saying the house was anxious for them to move in. The letters were becoming more bizarre. One time, the watcher asked if they'd discovered what was in the walls of the house. Another spoke about the watcher's childhood in the 1960s, running from room to room in 657 Boulevard and imagining the rich people who lived in it. By now, this was taking a toll on the family. There's nothing worse for parents than their children being threatened, especially when they can't even confront the person making those threats. Derek was suffering from insomnia and depression now, and Maria's psychologist diagnosed her with PTSD. They were both growing paranoid, but the police still had no leads. The Broaddus family tried everything to escape this nightmare. Not going to the house hadn't stopped the letters. They tried to sell the house, but they were required by law to inform new buyers about the letters. Obviously, nobody stayed interested in the house after reading what the watcher had been writing. They sued the Woods for not telling them about the letter they received before they bought the house. Then, Derek and Maria tried another idea. The watcher had made it clear he was obsessed with the house itself. He said in one letter that the house didn't like being renovated. So they figured they could sell the house to a developer who wanted to knock it down and build 2 new houses in its place. They figured the watcher was sure to attempt to save the house, and they might be able to get rid of him or even catch him when he stepped forward to stop them. But there was one big problem with that idea: the Neighborhood Planning Board. They said that if the plot of land their house was on was divided into 2, the 2 plots would be too small according to regulation. They were less than 3 feet smaller than they needed to be. They rejected the building plans, and the family lost their chance to sell the house. To make it worse, a reporter had found sections from some of the watcher's letters, and his story about 657 Boulevard went viral. Now everyone knew what was happening to the Broaddus family. Shockingly, just a few months later, the same planning board approved plans to do the same thing with another plot nearby, even though the 2 plots were way smaller than the ones the Broaddus family had proposed. Derek was furious. He was at breaking point, and in a fit of rage, he wrote a few threatening letters to neighbors and people involved. The people who received the letters said they were suspiciously similar to the ones written by the watcher. He admitted writing the letters to the neighbors and said he regretted his actions, but it was too late. The damage was done. Derek and Maria had been labeled as the #1 suspect in the hunt for the watcher. People were now saying that they'd faked the whole thing for a movie deal. It's worth pointing out that they'd specifically asked to remain anonymous in the Netflix series, and the money they made off it was way less than they'd lost on the house, so that theory seems unlikely. The family's last hope was to ignore the letters and keep renovating. They figured if they pretended they weren't scared, the letters would stop. It didn't work. The watcher wasn't happy about their renovations, saying the house was in pain because of all the changes, but he still stayed in touch. The family continued living in their parents' house to keep their children safe. Finally, in 2016, 2 years after the first letter had arrived, the Broaddus family found someone to rent the house. They'd included a clause in the contract that said he could get out of his lease agreement if another letter arrived. But the person who received the next letter wasn't the new renter. It was still addressed to the Broaddus family. This one sounded a lot more angry than the ones they received before. It was addressed to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. The watcher terrifyingly continued by saying that his army of supporters had blocked the family's attempts to destroy the house. It then threatened them, saying that if they had a car accident, became ill, or their pets or loved ones died, they would know it was the watcher who did it. He finished by saying the house despised them, and closed the letter with the words, "All hail the watcher." Amazingly, the people renting the house didn't leave. They installed more cameras, but to this day, they haven't received any letters from the watcher. The police are no closer to discovering who was behind the threatening letters, but you can bet whoever it was, is watching the Netflix series based on their letters about 657 Boulevard. Did you enjoy the video? Like and subscribe so you never miss the best stories. Do you think you know who the watcher was? Tell us in the comments. You might just solve the mystery.